The city had taught Dominic Varela that nothing stayed buried forever. Not secrets, not enemies, and certainly not the past. But he never expected his past to walk across a rain-slicked crosswalk on a Tuesday afternoon, visibly pregnant, and looking straight through him like he was already a ghost. The woman he'd divorced 6 months ago carried a secret that could either destroy him or save what was left of his soul, and she was about to disappear into the crowd. One choice, one moment, everything on the line. If you want to see how far love can bend before it breaks, stay with me until the end. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had started as a whisper that morning, the kind that barely touched the windshield before the wipers swept it away. By afternoon, it had become a steady rhythm against the glass, turning the city into a watercolor painting where everything bled at the edges. Dominic Varela sat behind the wheel of his black Mercedes, one hand draped over the steering wheel, the other resting against his jaw as he waited for the light to change. Traffic in the city center moved like blood through narrowing veins, slow, pressured, inevitable. He'd grown used to the pace. Hell, he'd orchestrated half of it. From his position at the top of the Varela organization, he controlled more than most people realized. Money moved where he wanted it to move. People fell in line or they fell off the map. It was simple mathematics, the kind that didn't require a calculator, just nerve and the willingness to make hard decisions without flinching. But today, something felt off. It wasn't the rain, it wasn't the traffic, it was the restlessness that had been crawling under his skin for weeks now, the kind that no amount of whiskey or midnight drives could shake loose. He'd attributed it to stress. There was always stress in his line of work. But deep down, he knew better. He knew exactly what it was, or rather, who it was. The light ahead turned green, but the crosswalk was still full of people hustling across the intersection, umbrellas bumping into each other like a swarm of black beetles. Dominic's foot hovered over the gas pedal, waiting. His gaze drifted across the faces. Blank, hurried, anonymous. Nobody looked at anybody in this city. That was the unspoken rule. You kept your head down, you minded your business, you survived. Then he saw her, and the world stopped. Lena. She stood at the edge of the crosswalk, maybe 20 feet away, her coat pulled tight around her body. Her dark hair was longer than he remembered, falling past her shoulders in soft waves that clung to the damp fabric of her collar. She wasn't carrying an umbrella. She never did. Said they made her feel trapped, like she couldn't see what was coming. But it wasn't the hair or the coat or even the rain-soaked defiance in the way she stood that made his breath catch in his throat. It was the curve of her belly. Unmistakable, undeniable, pregnant. Dominic's hand tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles going white. 6 months. It had been 6 months since the divorce papers were signed, since she'd walked out of his life without looking back, since he'd convinced himself that letting her go was the right thing to do. 6 months of silence. 6 months of pretending he didn't still reach for her side of the bed in the middle of the night. And now this. His mind raced, doing the math, tracing timelines, calculating possibilities. If she was showing this much, she had to be at least 4 or 5 months along. Maybe more. Which meant his chest tightened, which meant the baby could be his. Their eyes met across the rain and the distance and the wreckage of everything they used to be. For a split second, he saw something flicker in her expression. Recognition, maybe, or shock, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Her face smoothed into that calm, unreadable mask she'd always worn when she was protecting herself. From him, from the world, from whatever storm was coming next. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd on the opposite sidewalk. Behind him, a horn blared. Once. Twice. The light had been green for 10 seconds, and he hadn't moved. Dominic blinked, his pulse hammering in his ears, and jerked the car forward into the intersection. But his eyes stayed locked on the spot where she'd been standing, even as the traffic swallowed the view. He pulled over 2 blocks later, ignoring the angry honks from the cars behind him, and sat there with the engine idling and the rain drumming against the roof. His phone was in his hand before he realized he'd grabbed it, his thumb hovering over her name in his contacts. He hadn't deleted it. He told himself 100 times that he should, that keeping it was just another way of holding on to something that was already gone. But he never did. And now, staring at her name on the screen, He didn't know whether to call or throw the damn phone out the window. What would he even say? I saw you. You're pregnant. Is it mine? The words felt too blunt, too invasive, too much like the man she'd left behind. He set the phone down on the passenger seat and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Think. He needed to think, but all he could see was the curve of her belly and the way she'd looked at him for that one fractured second before she disappeared. She hadn't tried to hide it. She hadn't run. She'd just looked at him. And then she'd walked away, like she'd already made her decision, like he didn't get a say. Dominic's jaw tightened. No, he wasn't doing this. He wasn't going to sit here and spiral while she carried on with her life like he didn't exist. If that baby was his, and every instinct he had was screaming that it was, then he had a right to know. He had a right to be part of it. He grabbed his phone again and pulled up a contact he hadn't used in months. Marco, his most trusted man, the one who handled the things Dominic didn't have time for or didn't want to dirty his hands with. The call connected on the second ring. Boss, Marco's voice came through, calm and ready. I need you to find someone, Dominic said, his voice rough, edged with something he couldn't quite name. Lena Hayes. Last known address was the apartment on 7th, but she's not there anymore. I need her current location. Quietly. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that said Marco was weighing whether or not to ask questions. Smart man. How fast do you need it? Yesterday. Consider it done. Dominic ended the call and stared out at the rain-slicked street. Somewhere out there, Lena was walking through the city, carrying a secret that could change everything. And whether she liked it or not, he was going to find her. He was going to get answers. And if that baby was his, then nothing, not the divorce, not the distance, not the walls she'd built around herself, was going to keep him away. It took Marco less than 3 hours. Dominic was in his office when the text came through, just an address and a single line. She's been staying here for 2 months, keeps to herself. No visitors. The address was in a quieter part of the city, away from the noise and the chaos of downtown. A neighborhood where people didn't ask questions and minded their own business. Smart. She'd always been smart. He didn't wait. By the time the sun started to dip below the skyline, Dominic was parked across the street from a modest brick building with flower boxes in the windows and a corner cafe on the ground floor. He watched the entrance, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel, his mind running through a dozen different scenarios. What if she refused to talk to him? What if she slammed the door in his face? What if she told him the baby wasn't his? That last one twisted something sharp in his chest, but he pushed it down. He'd deal with whatever came. He always did. 20 minutes later, the door opened, and there she was. Lena stepped out onto the sidewalk, her coat buttoned against the evening chill, a small canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She moved with that same quiet grace he remembered, unhurried but purposeful, like she knew exactly where she was going and didn't need anyone's permission to get there. Dominic got out of the car. She didn't see him at first. She was looking down, adjusting the strap of her bag, her hair falling forward to hide her face. But when she glanced up and saw him standing there, she stopped. Just stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. The street hummed with distant traffic and the murmur of voices from the cafe, but it all felt very far away. It was just the two of them, standing 10 feet apart, with 6 months of silence and 1,000 unspoken words hanging in the air between them. Dominic. Her voice was steady, controlled. She'd always been good at that. Lena. She didn't ask him what he was doing there. She didn't act surprised. She just looked at him with those dark, careful eyes, and he realized she'd been expecting this. Maybe not today, maybe not here, but somewhere, somehow, she'd known he would find her. How long have you been following me? She asked quietly. I'm not following you. His voice came out rougher than he intended. I saw you this afternoon at the crosswalk. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a slight tensing of her shoulders. I know, she said. You know. I saw you too. The admission hung there, fragile and dangerous. And you just walked away, Dominic said, taking a step closer. You didn't say anything. You didn't. What did you expect me to do? Lena's voice sharpened, just a fraction. Run to your car? Throw myself at you? We're divorced, Dominic. We haven't spoken in 6 months. You're pregnant. The words came out flat, brutal in their simplicity. Lena's hand moved instinctively to her belly, a protective gesture that told him everything he needed to know before she even opened her mouth. "Yes," she said. "I am." "Is it mine?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Lena's jaw tightened, and for a second he thought she might turn around and walk away. But she didn't. She held his gaze, unflinching. Yes. The air left his lungs in a rush. He'd known. Somewhere deep down, he'd known. But hearing her say it out loud was something else entirely. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to know." The honesty of it hit harder than any lie would have. "You didn't want—" Dominic stopped, forced himself to breathe, to think. "Lena, this is my child. You don't get to just— I get to do whatever I want," she said, her voice low and fierce. "You don't own me anymore, Dominic. You don't get to make decisions for me. I left because I needed to be free of you, of that life, of everything that came with being your wife, and I'm not going back. I'm not asking you to come back." "Then what are you asking?" He didn't have an answer, not one that made sense, not one that didn't sound like a demand or a threat or a desperate attempt to claw back something he'd already lost. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bleeding into every word. "I just want to know. I want to be part of this." "Why?" The question caught him off guard. "Because it's my child," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. That's not an answer. Lena's eyes searched his face, looking for something he wasn't sure he could give. "You spent years keeping me at arm's length, Dominic. You built walls around everything that mattered, including me. You chose that life over and over again, even when I begged you not to. So why now? Why does this suddenly matter?" "Because it's different." "How?" "Because it's ours." The words came out raw, unguarded, and he saw the way they landed, the way her breath hitched, the way her hand tightened on the strap of her bag. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lena shook her head, a sad, tired smile ghosting across her lips. "I can't do this right now," she said softly. "I can't stand here and fight with you in the middle of the street. Then let me walk with you." "Dominic, please." The word felt foreign on his tongue. He didn't beg. He didn't ask. But this wasn't business. This wasn't a negotiation. This was Lena, and the baby she was carrying, and the chance to be something more than the man he'd been. She looked at him for a long time, weighing something he couldn't see. "Fine," she said finally, "but just to the cafe, and then you leave." "Deal." They started walking side by side, the distance between them carefully measured. The cafe was only a block away, a cozy little place with warm lights and the smell of coffee drifting out into the evening air. Lena had always loved places like this, small, quiet, unassuming, the opposite of everything his world represented. "How long have you been living here?" Dominic asked, breaking the silence. 2 months. "Alone?" "Yes." "That's not safe." Lena shot him a look, one eyebrow raised. "Safer than being with you." He didn't have a comeback for that, because she was right. They reached the cafe, and Lena pushed open the door, the little bell above it chiming softly. Inside, the place was nearly empty, just a couple at a corner table and an older man reading a newspaper by the window. Lena chose a table near the back, away from the windows, and Dominic sat down across from her. A waitress came over, a young woman with a tired smile, and took their orders. Lena asked for herbal tea. Dominic ordered black coffee. When the waitress left, the silence stretched between them again, heavier this time. "You look good," Dominic said finally, because he didn't know what else to say. Lena let out a soft, humorless laugh. "I look exhausted." "You look beautiful." She glanced up at him, surprise flickering in her eyes, and for a second he saw the woman he'd married, the one who used to smile at him like he was more than just the sum of his worst decisions. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't do that. Don't try to charm me. I'm not that person anymore." "I'm not trying to charm you. I'm telling you the truth." Lena shook her head and looked away, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. "You always did have a way with words when you wanted something." "I don't want something. I want to know my child." "And then what?" Lena's gaze snapped back to his, sharp and challenging. You show up at doctor's appointments? You buy a crib? You pretend you're not running an empire built on blood and fear? I'm not pretending anything. Then what are you doing, Dominic? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to have it both ways. You want to be the father, but you don't want to change. You want to be part of this, but you don't want to give up the life that drove me away in the first place. The words hit like a punch to the gut, and he couldn't deny them. Because she was right. He didn't know how to be both. He'd spent his entire adult life building the Varela name into something untouchable, something feared. And now, sitting across from the woman who'd once been his whole world, he realized he didn't know how to be anything else. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, the words coming out rough and unsteady. I don't know how to be what you need, but I'm trying. Lena's expression softened, just a fraction. Trying isn't enough, Dominic. Not for me. Not for this baby. Then tell me what is. She was quiet for a long time, her hand resting on her belly, her eyes distant. Honesty, she said finally. Respect. And no interference from your world. If you want to be part of this, you come as you, not as the boss, not as Dominic Varela, the untouchable. Just you. And if I even get a hint that your life is spilling over into ours, I'm gone. Do you understand? Dominic nodded slowly. I understand. I mean it. 1 foot out of line, 1 threat, 1 whisper of danger, and I disappear. And this time, you won't find me. I understand, he said again, and he meant it. The waitress returned with their drinks, setting them down with a quiet clatter. Lena wrapped her hands around her cup, the steam rising between them like a veil. When are you due? Dominic asked, his voice gentler now. March. 4 months. He had 4 months to prove he could be the man she needed. 4 months to figure out how to protect her and the baby without suffocating them. 4 months to earn back even a fraction of the trust he'd destroyed. Have you been to a doctor? He asked. Yes, everything's fine. And you've been managing on your own? Lena's eyes narrowed slightly. I'm not helpless, Dominic. I didn't say you were, He stopped, exhaled. I just want to help. Then respect my boundaries. I will. They sat there in silence, sipping their drinks, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them. Outside, the rain had started again, streaking down the windows in slow, lazy trails. I should go, Lena said eventually, setting down her cup. Dominic nodded, but he didn't move. Can I see you again? Lena hesitated, her eyes searching his face. Maybe, she said, but not like this. Not with you showing up out of nowhere. If you want to be part of this, we do it on my terms. Agreed? Agreed. She stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder, and Dominic rose with her. For a moment, they just stood there, inches apart. The air between them charged with everything they'd once been, and everything they might never be again. Good night, Dominic, Lena said softly. Good night, Lena. She walked out into the rain, and he watched her go, his chest tight with a feeling he couldn't name. Hope, maybe. Or fear. Or something in between. He didn't know how this was going to end. But for the first time in 6 months, he felt like he had something worth fighting for. And Dominic Varela had never lost a fight that mattered. Over the next 2 weeks, Dominic learned what it meant to wait. He didn't show up at her apartment. He didn't send Marco to keep tabs on her. He kept his distance just like she'd asked, even though every instinct screamed at him to be closer, to make sure she was safe, to fix everything that had gone wrong between them. But waiting didn't mean doing nothing. He started small. A delivery of groceries to her building, unsigned, nothing flashy. Just the basics. Fresh produce, high-quality proteins, the kind of things a pregnant woman should be eating. He didn't know if she kept them or threw them away, but 3 days later, another delivery arrived at her door. This time, prenatal vitamins and a weighted blanket. Still no note, still no name. But she had to know it was him. On the 10th day, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop sending things. He stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. Are you taking the vitamins? The reply came almost instantly. That's not the point. But are you? A long pause, then, yes. Dominic smiled, a small, private thing that felt strange on his face. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next message came a minute later. I have a doctor's appointment Thursday at 2. If you want to come, you can, but you follow my rules. His heart kicked hard against his ribs. I'll be there. Don't be late. He wasn't. Thursday afternoon, Dominic stood outside the women's health clinic on the east side of the city, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat, his pulse hammering in a way that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with the fact that Lena was about to let him into her world again. She arrived 5 minutes early, her coat wrapped tight around her, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. She looked tired, but there was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there at the cafe. You came, she said, stopping a few feet away. I said I would. She nodded, studying him for a moment, then gestured toward the door. Come on, we'll be late. Inside, the clinic was warm and bright, the waiting room filled with soft music and pastel colors designed to calm anxious mothers-to-be. Lena checked in at the front desk, and Dominic followed her to a pair of chairs near the window. How are you feeling? He asked, keeping his voice low. Tired. Nauseous. The usual. Is it bad? It's manageable. They sat in silence for a few minutes, and then a nurse called Lena's name. She stood, and Dominic followed, his heart pounding harder with every step. The exam room was small and sterile, the kind of place that made everything feel clinical and impersonal. But when the ultrasound technician came in, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, the atmosphere shifted. Hi, Lena, the technician said warmly. How are we doing today? Good. Tired, but good. And who's this? The technician glanced at Dominic with a smile. This is Dominic, Lena said, hesitating just slightly. The father. The words landed like a benediction, and Dominic felt something loosen in his chest. Nice to meet you, Dominic. I'm Sarah. Let's take a look at your baby, shall we? Lena lay back on the exam table, and Sarah squeezed gel onto her belly, the ultrasound wand gliding across her skin. The monitor flickered to life, and Dominic found himself leaning forward, his eyes locked on the screen. At first, he didn't know what he was looking at, just grainy black and white shapes that didn't make sense. But then Sarah pointed, her voice soft and excited. There, see? That's the head, and those are the hands. And suddenly, Dominic could see it. The curve of a tiny skull, the flicker of movement, the impossibly small shape of a life that was half him and half Lena. And here, Sarah said, adjusting the wand, is the heartbeat. The sound filled the room, fast, rhythmic, steady, a drumbeat that echoed through Dominic's entire body, his baby's heartbeat. He didn't realize he was holding his breath until Lena's hand found his, her fingers lacing through his with a squeeze that said, I know. And for the first time in 6 months, Dominic felt something other than regret. He felt hope. The sound of the heartbeat stayed with Dominic long after they left the clinic. It echoed in his mind during the silent drive back to Lena's neighborhood, through the awkward moment when she thanked him for coming, and later that night when he sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the city lights and wondering how something so small could change everything. She'd let him hold her hand during the ultrasound. That meant something. It had to. But when he'd offered to drive her home, she'd declined. When he'd suggested dinner, she'd shaken her head with a tired smile that said not yet. She was letting him in, but only an inch at a time, and Dominic had to remind himself that patience was a skill he'd never quite mastered. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. Marco. Talk to me, Dominic said, answering on the second ring. We've got movement on the Castellano situation. They're pushing back on the territory lines we established last month. Word is they're meeting with some of the smaller families trying to build a coalition. Dominic's jaw tightened. The Castellanos had been a thorn in his side for years, ambitious, reckless, and too stupid to know when they were outmatched. How serious? Serious enough that you need to show your face. Remind people why they don't cross you. Dominic closed his eyes, the weight of his world pressing down on him. A month ago, he would have handled this without a second thought, would have walked into whatever room the Castellanos were using for their little power play and made it clear that challenging him was a death sentence. But now, there was Lena, and the baby, and the promise he'd made to keep that world away from them. Set up a meeting, Dominic said finally, but keep it clean. No theatrics. I want this resolved quietly. There was a pause on the other end, and Dominic could almost hear Marco's surprise. You sure, boss? These guys respond to strength, not diplomacy. I'm aware, but I want it done my way. Understood? Understood. Dominic ended the call and sat in the silence, the heartbeat still echoing in his memory. Now, 3 days later, Lena texted him. "There's a cafe 2 blocks from my apartment. Good coffee, if you're free tomorrow morning." Dominic stared at the message, reading it 3 times to make sure he wasn't imagining it. She was reaching out. On her terms, like she'd said, but still. She was reaching out. "What time?" he typed back. 9:30. "Don't bring flowers or anything ridiculous." He smiled despite himself. Noted. The next morning, Dominic arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early, ordered 2 coffees, 1 black, 1 with cream and honey the way Lena used to take it, and sat at a table near the window where he could see the street. The place was exactly the kind she loved. Warm lighting, mismatched furniture, the smell of fresh pastries in the air. It reminded him of the early days before everything got complicated, when she used to drag him to places like this on Sunday mornings, and he'd pretend to be annoyed but secretly loved watching her enjoy something so simple. When she walked in, right at 9:30, she looked more rested than she had at the clinic. She'd let her hair down, and there was color in her cheeks that hadn't been there before. "You're early," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. "Old habit." She glanced at the 2 cups on the table. "You remember how I take my coffee." "Some things you don't forget." Lena picked up her cup, took a sip, and something softened in her expression. "It's good. Thank you." "You're welcome." For a few minutes they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that felt less like distance and more like 2 people trying to figure out how to be around each other again. Outside, the morning traffic hummed past, and somewhere in the back of the cafe, a barista was singing along to a song on the radio. "So?" Lena said eventually, setting down her cup. "I've been thinking." About what this looks like, if you're going to be part of this." Dominic's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'm listening." "I meant what I said at the clinic. If you want to be involved, it's on my terms. That means doctor's appointments when I invite you, updates when I feel like giving them, and absolutely no interference in my life otherwise." She paused, her gaze steady. "But it also means honesty, from both of us. If you're keeping things from me, if you're pulling strings behind my back, if I even suspect you're manipulating this situation, I'm done. Clear?" "Crystal." "I'm serious, Dominic." "So am I." She studied him for a long moment, like she was trying to see past the walls he'd built over the years, trying to find the man she'd fallen in love with underneath all the armor. "Why do you want this?" she asked quietly. "And don't tell me it's just because the baby's yours. I need to know why it matters to you." Dominic leaned back in his chair, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup, and for once he didn't have a rehearsed answer. He didn't have a strategy or an angle. He just had the truth. "Because I spent 6 months trying to convince myself that letting you go was the right thing," he said, his voice rough. "And every single day I woke up knowing it wasn't. I told myself you were better off without me, that you deserved someone who could give you a normal life, someone who wasn't constantly looking over his shoulder. And maybe that's true. Maybe you do deserve better." He paused, meeting her eyes. "But when I saw you at that crosswalk, when I realized you were carrying my child, it hit me that I'd been lying to myself. I don't want to let you go. I don't want to miss this. And I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm asking for one anyway." Lena's breath hitched, and for a second, he thought he saw her eyes glisten, but she blinked it away, her composure snapping back into place. "You hurt me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shut me out over and over. You chose that life, that power, that control, and you left me standing on the outside wondering if I even mattered. You mattered. You still do. Then why wasn't that enough?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "Because I didn't know how to be both," Dominic admitted. "I didn't know how to be the man you needed and the man I thought I had to be. And by the time I figured it out, you were already gone." Lena looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I don't know if I can trust you again." "I know. And I don't know if this is going to work." "I know that too." She looked up, and there was something raw in her expression, something vulnerable that she rarely let show. "But I want to try. For the baby. And maybe for me too." Dominic felt something crack open in his chest, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. Hope. Fragile, dangerous hope. Then we try, he said. Lena nodded slowly, and for the first time since he'd seen her at the crosswalk, she smiled. It wasn't the bright, carefree smile he remembered from years ago, but it was real, and it was enough. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Dominic showed up for the appointments Lena invited him to, one every 2 weeks, always at the same clinic, always with Sarah, the ultrasound technician, who greeted them like old friends. He started learning things he'd never thought about before. The difference between Braxton Hicks contractions and real labor, the importance of folic acid, the way Lena's cravings shifted from salty to sweet and back again without warning. They talked more too, not about the past, not yet, but about small things. About the books Lena was reading, about the nursery she was slowly putting together in her tiny apartment, about names they both liked and the ones they absolutely didn't. If it's a girl, I like Sophia, Lena said one afternoon as they walked through the park near her building. The weather had turned colder, the trees stripped bare, but the sun was out and she'd wanted fresh air. Sophia Varela. Dominic tested the sound of it. I like it. I didn't say Varela. He glanced at her. What would the last name be? Lena was quiet for a moment, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. I don't know yet. I haven't decided. It stung, but he didn't push. And if it's a boy? I don't know, maybe Gabriel or Daniel? Gabriel Hayes, Dominic said, and Lena shot him a look. Or Gabriel Varela. Or Gabriel Hayes Varela. Or something completely different. She shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. You're impossible. I'm just trying to figure out where I fit. You fit where I let you fit. That's the deal, remember? I remember. They walked in silence for a while, their steps falling into sync. It was strange, this careful dance they were doing, close but not too close, connected but still separate. Dominic wanted more. He wanted to pull her into his arms, to kiss her the way he used to tell her that he'd burn the whole world down if it meant keeping her safe. But he knew that wasn't what she needed, so he kept his distance and hoped that eventually the space between them would close on its own. Can I ask you something? Lena said, breaking the silence. Anything. Are you still involved? In the business? Dominic had been waiting for this question, dreading it if he was honest. Yes, he said, because lying to her was out of the question. Lena's jaw tightened, but she didn't stop walking. How involved? I'm still running things, but I've been pulling back where I can, delegating more, keeping things quieter. Quieter doesn't mean safer. I know. She stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes searching his. Dominic, I meant what I said. If your world touches mine, it won't. You can't promise that. I can try. Trying isn't good enough. He wanted to argue, to tell her that he had everything under control, that he'd built walls around her so high that nothing could get through. But the truth was, he couldn't guarantee her safety. Not completely. Not in his world. I'm doing everything I can, he said quietly. I've kept your location off the radar. No one in my organization knows about you or the baby except Marco, and he'd die before he talked. I've made sure you're protected without you even knowing it. Lena's expression shifted, something between anger and resignation crossing her face. You've been watching me. Protecting you. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see the war happening behind her eyes, the part of her that wanted to believe him fighting against the part that had learned not to trust. I don't want to be a prisoner again, she said finally, her voice breaking just slightly. I left because I couldn't breathe. Because every decision, every movement, every second of my life was controlled by your world, and I can't go back to that. You won't have to. You keep saying that, but how do I know it's true? Dominic took a step closer, closing the distance between them, and when he spoke, his voice was raw with a desperation he couldn't hide. Because losing you the first time almost destroyed me, and I'll be damned if I let it happen again. Lena's breath caught, and for a second he thought she might pull away, but she didn't. She just stood there, her eyes locked on his, and something unspoken passed between them. I want to believe you, she whispered. Then believe me. Before either of them could say anything else, Lena's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and her expression shifted. "Everything okay?" Dominic asked. "Yeah, just a reminder for my next appointment. It's in 2 days. You want me there?" Lena hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I do." It wasn't much, but it was progress. The next appointment was routine. Blood pressure, weight check, another ultrasound to make sure the baby was developing normally. Sarah walked them through everything with her usual